World War II was obviously the dividing line, because from stay-at-home moms to women working and people moving across the country. People had stayed put, pretty much. People lived for whole generations, maybe in the same county, didn't move around or anything. And then you get World War II, where because people having to go to jobs in different places and things like that, you had this, you're right, a whole new kind of a thing.
So when did you meet your husband?
Oh, well, I met him because he was a friend of my parents and some friends of theirs. He's working with station, and my dad was driving a gas truck at the time, so I was at the service, and I met him. And he was about 4 years older than I was, and I was 16 at the time, so it didn't occur to me that I'd be going out with him, but it sort of happened, and for a strange reason, my parents didn't object. They objected to particularly everybody else all along the line, and he did too. So the fact that my parents let me go out with him was really an anomaly at the time. So we went together from right after he got out of the Navy, in about May, June, something like that. He got out in May of 1946. And then in the fall, he went to, because there wasn't much of anything for him to do in Delta for a job. And so he went up to live with his sister, her husband, in Alcoa, because he could get a job up there. And so we wrote letters back and forth, and then he came back in the summer of 1947, the spring, actually, of 1947, and asked me to marry him, and I said yes. And my parents were thoroughly annoyed because they had prepared to borrow money for me to go on to college, and so we had some kind of sticky times through that period of time. But at any rate, we were married on the 7th of December in 1947. We'd spent summer building our house. My folks had this big property in Delta. They had literally a lot on the side of it that didn't have anything on it. We'd had just a yard out there. So we built this small 2-room house, and it was really sort of interesting because at the time, it was being right after the war. You couldn't buy plumbing fixtures and all this kind of thing. So the construction was really pretty basic, and when we moved into it, the walls had no covering. We bought asbestos with well, it wasn't asbestos, it was whatever, fiberboard, to use for wallboard. The weekend we were married, and that took all the money. We had to borrow money to pay the furniture. And we were married in a private home, by the way, CO and what's his name? Wenholz. Anyway, he had helped us with construction. He built windows for our house and all that kind of thing. So we were married in our house and spent the next 3 days putting up the wallboard. And we didn't have a bathroom. We had a bathroom, but there were no fixtures in it because we hadn't been able to buy any plumbing fixtures. So we had to run for water and go to the bathroom and take baths and everything to my parents for the first several months after we were married. And I spent the weekend also canning a bushel of peaches. And had given us a bushel of peaches that were very, very ripe. And rather than let them go to waste, because we couldn't afford to let them go to waste, I was canning them. And I canned them on a burner kerosene stove. Because next door, my mother's house, my grandmother and 2 aunts were busily canning fruit. They had come from Kansas ostensibly for my wedding, but the awful truth was they came from Kansas to can a lot of fruit because, of course, the Delta Paonia area, big fruit growing area. So they were over there with tubs and tubs of peaches and pears, I don't know what all, canning in my mother's kitchen and canning with no water in my 2 little burner kerosene stove. Anyway, so this all worked out really very well. Fairly calm for a couple of years we were married. I mopped and waxed floors every single day, and I washed and ironed on Thursday, whatever happened. And as a matter of fact, then when I was pregnant with Douglas and he was born on a Thursday night, I was in the middle of ironing when it became apparent that I was going to have a baby. And so I went to the hospital, and it was an old house. It was an big old 2-story house. It had rooms just kind of up into portions. There was no operating room or anything. For having a baby, you had a baby in a room. They put up a screen between, and that was it. You had to stay in the hospital for 5 days. at the time, in bed for 5 days. And it was apple season, November, so there were a lot of apples. So a lot of the farmers had given the hospital apples. And we had apples 3 times a day. I mean, apples for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. One form, more than one form sometimes. We had so many apples that I didn't even eat years after that. It was so terrible. But, I mean, it was very nice. And a lady baby there, which was the day after Doug was born, too funny. They named him Rocky. I have no idea why they named this child Rocky. I mean, this is a small Colorado town. Why is somebody calling a child Rocky? He's going to have to grow up named Rocky. Anyway, poor kid grew up Rocky, I guess. But she was a very nice lady. Anyway, so then after that, and you have a small child, that's basically what you do, is take care of the small child.
So now, why floors and laundry on Thursday?
Oh, well, you just, you develop your own little routine. Partly, this is probably to some extent a repercussion from my mother. My mother was very casual housekeeper, very casual. And of course she had well over a number of years, and since she had gotten a lot better. But she was really not a very good housekeeper, and so at home, but nonetheless, she was very organized. So it was a compensation kind of a thing. So that, by golly, I did this and this and this on these days and times. Got up to crack on. He was an apprentice plumber. When he went back to Colorado, proposed, and we prepared to get married. He apprenticed to a plumbing company, Akers, and so he obviously wasn't making very much money. As I recall, he started at $1.25 an hour, and so it took us a while to pay off even the little bit of money we owed on the things that we built the house with. With both of us working in the summer, we'd pay for cash for most everything as we were going, but all in all, it was not much money. Well, then came the winter, and some weeks he was bringing $10 a week, and even in those days, in the late 40s, $10 a week wasn't paying much of anything. So fortunately, those peaches and things I'd canned, one thing and another helped. And one of the things that was particular life someplace, and this guy started coming to our house at dinner time about 2 or 3 nights a week. Well, because we didn't have any money, buy 2 little pieces of meat, or 1 piece of meat. We made it into 2 little pieces of meat. So I'd have 2 little pieces of meat. So this man is there for dinner, and so who doesn't get meat? So 2 or 3 nights a week, I was not getting any meat because this man was dropping in. And there was nothing wrong with it except that for dinner time, that often was not that pleasant under the general circumstances. But other than that, our life was fairly calm. The only thing that was, I guess, particularly aggravating during the first 2 years, really, was that if he and I got into any kind of an argument, him, I was wrong. If I didn't want to do something, or if I took any kind of a position, then it was my fault. I should not do that. He was right. And this came, I guess, my father was of a generation certainly where the man was the person. Even this, aggravated CB to death, because he knew that sometimes he wasn't always right. They belonged in it. And also, my mother tapping on the door, 1 tap and coming in. I mean, there was no 2 taps and coming in, 1 tap and coming in. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it. In the first place, I was barely 18 when I married. And so there's a certain trepidation at saying, don't do that. Knock on my door and wait until I come to the door. So that was a little bit of aggravation. We had a number of other young friends who were couples very, very like us. Some people who had been neighbors' daughters who married and so on. But we didn't have much of a social life because we couldn't afford a social life. So that's the only thing that I did that was really kind of social was we had it was not exactly a mother's club. It was just a group of young women who got together about once a month to have dessert and to sit around and embroider things or mend things or something like that, just to get away from husband and child or children, because otherwise we didn't have much of an opportunity to do so. And about twice a year, I think, which means probably about 4 times, we would go out dancing to it's a Bell Creek, was one of these country places where they had dances, and then some organizations met and things like that. It was just a meeting house out in the country. And so we did go out there sometimes. And then when Doug was on the way, these friends, again, man CB had known, Jim Griffith, married a really dull woman. I mean, really dull. And out of the Navy and became a teacher. Shouldn't have done because he was not really fitted for it. But he was in college in Gunnison, which is about 90 miles from Delta. And they would come down weekends. And the problem with this is they came by to play cards every Saturday night. Well, being very, very pregnant, sitting around for hours on end playing cards until 2 in the morning every Saturday night. And again, it's like there was no way out of this. We knew they were coming out on Saturday nights, so you could say, oh, we have to be away. They knew we didn't have to be away. We didn't have any money to go anyplace. So every Saturday night, Doug was on the way, very uncomfortably, these people are coming down and playing cards all hours of the night. And this was really really terrible because they were nice enough people, but not every Saturday night people. So anyhow. And then a major leap was in 1950 when the Korean War stopped waving them around.
Well, no, the waving's fine, but I think the clicking thing's probably going to pick up on the microphone.
Oh. Why would I try putting them over here? Don't do that.
I want you to feel happy with them, but like so. I mean,
but sticking my fingernails.
Yeah, no. Do you have a thing that you play with sometimes? Like
yeah, I usually get a pencil.
Like that. That's
okay.
fine. No, I want you to be happy with your hand. I'm just afraid that they're gonna do wild, crazy things.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So back and say.
Okay. Well, the next major change in our life that came along was in 1950, the Korean War started heating up, and CB was in the reserves at that time. He had stayed in the reserve. Everybody did after they got in World War II. And so what specialties they'd be calling up, and his was one of them. So he was almost positive that he was going to be called back into the Navy. And at almost exactly the same time, he had completed his apprenticeship in the plumbing and pipe fitting. So we went to Denver because at that for any kind of union testing or not union, but for job. Oh, why? How can I think what the word is? But anyhow, having gone through his training, Denver was the only place to test to prove that in fact he knew his job. So we packed up and went to Denver. It was pretty exciting. Stayed in a hotel. We'd never been together in a hotel before. And here's Doug was a baby, and so carrying this child's toilet seats through the lobby of the hotel because he was in toilet training, which was those things. Anyway, so he took the test. No, I think it was almost a month before we found, and at almost exactly the same time, he decided to simply voluntarily go back to the Navy. So that he would have an option, because if he waited till he got called up, he could very well be someplace, really terrible. So he volunteered and was sent to Fisher Island for 6 weeks of doing basic training, and then was sent to San Diego to serve on the Surrey, which was a submarine tender. Well, by this time I was very pregnant, and so staying at home, even though with my parents next door, was a very lonely situation. Effectively a baby because Doug was like 1.5 old, and very pregnant, no car because we didn't have one at that point, and so it was a very difficult time, and so in, I guess June, and Alan was expected in late August, early September. The doctor said, well, if you're going to go to California, it's going to have to be right away. So
we might want to just
cut this off for now.
Meditate.
And yeah, I must have done, and I'd almost bet that they were stored back at my parents' home in some of the stuff that was back there. And then when my parents moved out here, Dad went back and barely salvaged a little bit of stuff that was at the house to bring out here, simply got rid of everything else. But at the time you're going through this whole thing, are back?
We're back.
Okay. you're really thinking about survival, which was surviving with little kids and so on. So anyway, yes, he wrote fairly often, actually, during this period from about April till I came to California then at the end of July. With Doug on a plane. We flew from Grand Junction. We had almost no money. I bought the airline. I think Bud loaned me $10 that I would have some money to buy some food on the way. And so we landed at LAX and then had to catch another flight on down to San Diego. And I remember buying a vegetable plate at the airport restaurant because that was the most expensive Doug and I with. But actually he flew very well. But I was very large with Alan. It just here I was, very, very pregnant again with this kid, a year and a half old at that point. So we arrived in San Diego to have Doug be absolutely, totally terrified of his father because he was in Navy uniform. He had to come directly from the ship, and his friend brought him. And here's this really strange man. I mean, I missed him terribly when he was first gone. Baby, it was a horrible thing. But this strange person in this blue suit was just terrifying to him. He screamed and kicked out, and it was really exciting. But we went to this, we found a duplex, went to the duplex, and renting the duplex was sort of exciting. We'd been out house hunting for some little while, and at the time was very unfriendly to Navy people, very unfriendly. They've since gotten better, but not a whole lot better. And literally, because he was usually in Navy uniform, because as long as he was living down there, he was living on the ship. He wasn't ever staying off, so he really didn't have civilian clothes. And he would try to rent places, and then they would get him off. They chased him off. In one case, he actually hit a man because the man said terrible things about him. So that was pretty exciting. I was told about this afterward. So at any rate, we had this duplex, which turned out to be a decent enough place to live. And Alan was born from there. And actually, Alan's birth was really kind of interesting, too, because CB was on a ship. He had to stay on the ship for weekends, and he's off about the third night, except then about every other weekend he had to stay on. So Alan was one of the nights that he had to stay on the ship. So the landlady called him, helped me call him on the ship. Obviously, I couldn't talk to him, but they sent word and so on. Any of the officers on the ship so he could come off the ship. After 7 o'clock in the morning, they were supposed to take their night's sleep. So we're waiting, what's going to happen. And it happened, he was going to get to the hospital just almost the same time Alan was born. So it was not a major tragedy, but it was certainly one of those. I could hear the nurses staying just close to where my room was, and so she would, tell him, "Oh, fine, everything's all right," and the baby hasn't come yet, but so. And being born in Navy Hospital was interesting. We've spent a deal of time telling jokes on Alan for this. The basket bought him cost more than it cost at the hospital. We had to pay $4.75 for all our hospital expenses, medical expenses for Alan to be born in the Navy Hospital. And I think we paid something over $6 for the basket that we took him home in. Doug enjoyed having a baby brother. He immediately wanted him to be in front of cameras at any time a camera was around, because Doug's liked cameras. And I have no recollection at all that Doug had any problem with having a big brother. This was kind of strange, but I simply I have no memory of having any problem with it at all. But we did have trouble with the landlord, who was a very unpleasant man. And the silliest thing he was unpleasant about was that television was just coming in. This is like 52, and late 51, actually. And he would come over almost every afternoon and want us to watch television. Beanie and Cecil got really annoyed if we wouldn't come watch Beanie and Cecil. Well, here I am with two very old children, and I certainly wasn't going to watch Beanie and Cecil. And they had a child that they had adopted when they were a sort of gray market. I mean, they were mid-30s anyhow. And they'd adopted the boy who was now wanted a baby when they got him, but they really didn't want a 5-year-old by the time he turned 5. And he had become really antisocial. So he turned over the baby with Alan at 2 or 3 different times when I'd leave outside on the lawn in the sun, get a little sun. So I didn't dare leave him, and times we were only like 2 blocks off the bay, off Mission Bay in San Diego, and he would take Doug by hand and lead him out down the street. Doug was like, he's 2 years old now, and this was just really frightening. So we had put in to get into Navy housing, which would be less expensive, and also so I wouldn't have to put up with the situation that was there, and made clear, which meant huts in National City, and that was I think a definite experience. We need to go do something now because.
Quonset huts.
Okay, so we moved in Quonset huts in National City. They were interesting. We lived they had a family on either end, and so we lived in one end. They were very, very basic. They had 2 bedrooms and a big room that had kind of a kitchen thing on at one end, living room, dining room, everything. And so the floors were really interesting because they had painted them. Every time anybody moved in, well, they just paint over with paint. And then the way the Navy did paint, and I've heard this, and I think it's really true, they just mixed a whole lot of colors of paint together, and they this gray, that's everything. All painted this way. Unfortunately, it got crackling up. It would gradually just kind of crackle. They just painted over that. Nobody ever sanded down or even dug it off or anything. So here you have this just absolutely hard waves of paint sticking in the air. And linoleum right away because, after all, Doug's still a small child. What we did with him was the kids stayed in the playpen an awful lot because there was no way to let him out on that floor. The Quonset huts otherwise weren't too bad a place to live. They were, fairly snug. The big problem we had, I think, there was the people who lived at the other end. It was a young woman who had 4 children, and her husband was away on duty, and so she ran a lot, and she would leave her kids at night by themselves, and the oil barrels that fed the heaters for the 2 ends of the hut were the same, so everybody was using out the same supply of oil. And unfortunately, when she'd go out, these kids would have the heat on really, really high, leave the door open, and play out till hours of the night. She frequently didn't come until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Used all the heating oil, and they would fill the heating oil at certain times. And they started getting cold and having all kinds of tonsil problems and all kinds of things. So I had to go to the hospital. And the problem with that was that we didn't have a car. This meant major transportation. The transportation in the San Diego area was good, but from National City to the Navy Hospital, which was in Balboa Park, was a long way. And taking 2 little sick kids on the bus, and then of course the Navy Hospital, there were a lot of people, and so this meant you had long waits for anything. And it was just a terrible time. And to add complications at that point, the bank messed up our bank account. And so although most of the time I would get prescriptions for the medication, I'd get them filled at a drugstore in National City. So I had prescriptions at one point for Doug for a couple of things and wrote checks for them, and they bounced. And although we didn't have very much money because the Navy doesn't pay very much, nonetheless, we were really careful, and I knew there was money in the bank. So we went off to the bank to find out what the problem was. It turned out that there was another CB riddle listed at the bank. Now, my father always used Coley-B when he signed anything, but he actually, because really the only thing we used it for was to store money and to pay things like the drugstore. So the checks was just a mess, and they finally found the checks. I forced them to let me look at the checks, and the signature was thing like riddle. So, except they didn't apologize, they didn't do anything else. Unfortunately, the drugstore was really nice and so I said, that it was very nice from the Navy people in San Diego, but the people in that drugstore in National City really were because, it was away from what I thought was home, Colorado, and two small children, sick and I see it couldn't have rained every single day the whole winter, but it certainly felt like it. And so here we're cold because a good part of the time fuel oil was gone because of the situation next door and so on. So this was a pretty muggy time. We had a lot of good Navy friends, a number of men whose families weren't younger men who weren't married. Would come out like weekends, and the guys would work on bars outside the Quonset hut and everything. And we had very full meals, ate a lot of beans and that kind of stuff. So we had some pretty good friends, and then thinking of doing things with no money, for CB, they wanted to go to the races. There were some races at some kind of a track. And I don't recall where that was. At any rate, so it was a weekend, and there were 4 at our house. And so we pulled absolutely all the money and ours. And so 4 of us went to the races to celebrate CB's birthday. The other 2 guys stayed home and babysat while we went. There was enough money to buy 2 cups of coffee. We bought the tickets for the race. Now, payday everybody was going to go to the ship the next day because it was payday and they would get paid. But at that point, we had absolutely no money. And so it was really kind of an exciting time. It was really kind of fun, but you knew it wasn't going to last forever. The Korean War was continuing, but to be quite honest about it, in any sense, we weren't paying attention to it. The ship went out to sea 1 week a month, which allowed to buy cigarettes at sea prices. And that was about all that happened. And so we were really thinking about living there and kind of enjoying weather. When it wasn't raining, it was quite nice. And yes, we don't have any money, but this will be over with in approximately a year. So you don't have to take it seriously. You don't really have to think about what's going on. And we didn't, because we obviously didn't have television. And so we were no longer living near the people with B and Cecil. We weren't watching their television. So the news was not omnipresent. We didn't take a newspaper. It was just a disconnected time. You had no real feeling that this was going to last, so you just bobbed along. My parents came and visited. Fortunately, there was a medium-sized earthquake. This was the true blessing. They brought our car from Colorado, and then they went back on the train, I guess. So we did have a car after that. Didn't have to worry about that. But if you're in a Quonset hut that's up on blocks, and even medium-sized earthquake was pretty exciting. My father was ready to pack up and leave the next day. We talked him out of that, but he was not a happy person. But essentially, it was one of those kind of times that you just know isn't going to last, so you don't really even think about what you're doing particularly. I had celebrated. Well, they took a vote on how we were going to celebrate. And unfortunately, we were talking about half the Navy guys and my husband. The vote was between going to Jai Alai in Tijuana and a burlesque show in San Diego, and decided to go to the burlesque show. This was my birthday. I didn't want to go to Jai Alai. I didn't want to go to the burlesque show. But I was only 1 vote in 6. So we went to the burlesque show, which I was horrified by. It wasn't even particularly sexy, primarily because it was like the women overweight and not particularly attractive, and it was just pretty dull, actually. But it was a pretty funny thing to do for your 21st birthday, I have to tell you. Anyway, and so then, at the beginning of August in 1952, we left San Diego to return to Colorado. I was a little uncomfortable because I had written to Delta because my driver's license expired on my birthday, which was the 24th of July, and it renewed, and they wouldn't renew it by mail or anything. They wouldn't extend it to anything. So I drove. When I drove on the way back to Colorado, my driver's license was expired. And being a very law-abiding person, this made me very, very nervous. I was sure that we would be stopped every block. Because it was like the rest of August, it was really, really hot, and so we drove at night. We left San Diego, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was still like almost 100 degrees when we got to Phoenix. So it was really, really hot. And it's how it is now. But at that time, there was a place where you could go about different ways to get around Phoenix. And of course, I took the wrong one. Went about 20 miles the wrong direction. So finally we got to, I think it was Hobbs. No, not Hobbs. It doesn't matter, but a town in New Mexico, in Arizona. No, Hobbs, New Mexico. Up in the northeast corner of Arizona. We stopped off there. But come daylight, at a hotel room so that we could kind of clean up and let the kids have some rest. And I remember this, there was no shower, bathtub in this hotel room. It's a huge, big bathtub. And unfortunately, the water pressure was nil. It was nothing. So we were able to get about 4 inches of water. So we put things in that and kind of washed. And then we went out to have a meal. And it was absolutely enchanting because we were walking down the street and about the time we got down, he had a little plaid shirt and little blue jeans on. This lady had sent him, and he looked really cute in them. And he was like really round faced. He had a bowl haircut because his hair was so thick and long, and we didn't want to cut off really what. We wanted to see the parents to see how cute he looked with all that hair. And we were walking along the street. This Indian man came along with this little bit Indian kid that was really about our size, but probably a little bit, wearing almost exactly the same thing, a little red plaid shirt, blue jeans. And this kid is walking along, and we could have traded those kids. I mean, this little kid had a bowl cut. He had the plaid shirt and the blue jeans on. We looked out, the man also looked at Alan. Oh, looks like this kid. It was really pretty funny. So it was a really weird, interesting kind of a thing. Anyway, got back to Delta, and the little house we had built had been rented to people while we were gone. It wasn't big enough for us when we got back. I mean, it hadn't been too bad when Doug was a baby and we were there, because we had we actually were able to put his crib in the living room and so on, but two little is just too much in 2 rooms. South end of town, which we had to do some work on and one thing and another. And CB went back to work for Baker's Plumbing Company, and they were paying him $1.75 an hour, which was a very near thing. I mean, it was a long time ago, and things were a lot less expensive. But even so, $1.75 an hour meant that there was no spare money. And there was no question that I'd go to work. I didn't, and besides, I had no skills. And as a kid growing up, I'd worked in a drugstore, worked in a department store. It didn't make sense. So he did back to work, and we were trying to get a go of it, but it was just enormously difficult to do that. So friends things where at that point it looked as if the word was that the Air Force was going to build Force Academy near Colorado Springs, and so there was a lot of concern going on there, and so we ended up in Colorado Springs, and being there through the summer. The problem with that was that same time that we moved, they had about decided the Air Force Academy in Michigan, and so construction came to a dead halt shortly after we got over there. And then, in addition to that, for whatever unknown reason, at about this time, plumbers and pipe fitters decided to go on strike. So this was a combination of factors that was not good. It was very difficult. So at that point, we had no income coming in. So it was a really difficult time and scary, because here, we're back into civilian life and starting life with the kids and everything, and it was just impossible kind of a situation. So while this was happening, when we got to that point, and we were living in an apartment complex, but it was like single level. It was not upstairs or anything. And so he went job hunting at the time to find some kind of a job, and he did get some odd jobs, but there weren't too many things because there were a lot of work at that point. And I went to work in a restaurant. I think I went to work at 6, 7 o'clock and worked till 2 o'clock in the morning. And this is exciting because I would get home about 3 o'clock in the morning and have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning because CB was then going to go look for work. And so it was a very difficult time, and it's difficult to do to start with because I'd never worked as a waitress. Worked, you know, at a drugstore, putting sodas up on a counter, but in terms of waiting on people at tables and all the things that are involved in that, I'd never done. But because I had no other skills, that's what I did. And it was a crazy time. It was like we survived it, but it was just really difficult during that period of time. And then I got fired from the restaurant because there was a black nightclub across the street, and the musicians would come across in breaks when they're playing, and they would eat in this restaurant. Well, when I went to work there, shortly after I went to work, I was told I was supposed to turn the corner on their check when it went into the kitchen, and I didn't do that. I wasn't doing that, but a good waitress. And so he didn't do anything about it. You know, he didn't have a problem with this. Unfortunately, however, that, and he called me and chewed me up one side and down the other and said, you know, you were told when you came to work that you were supposed to do that. And I said, well, I'll do that. And so he fired me. So, okay, I was out of work.
For the sake of, go ahead and tell us why it's that you were supposed to turn down the corner.
Oh, okay. Just turn down the corner because then the food that came out of the kitchen was desirable. I mean, if they ordered fried chicken, they got the beat up pieces and stuff like that. So their plates came interesting too because these people provided a fair amount of income for this restaurant. There were about half a band members that came over almost every night. And of course, that was also, why did they do that? Well, why they did that was there was their place around to eat, because the Black nightclub had minimal food. It was basically a drink and wonderful programs. CV and I went over there on this after I was fired. We went over there and saw the show several different times, and they were always very nice to. Most of the clientele was black, but not everybody. There were other people in there, but it was a neat place to go. And wonderful music. And one of the exciting parts of my life was that the compositions for several times said that I really needed to get a job over there because they needed showgirls. Well, I was tall, very thin in those days, but I didn't see myself as a showgirl any place, so it didn't happen. But, you know, it was exotic. Anyway, this was not, I did not have any major deep concerns about turning down the corners on the tickets, and just that it didn't seem like a decent thing for anybody. But I had not grown up around any people of color. There were Mexican families living in Delta, on the edge of Delta, who did farm work and so on when we lived there, but they really were not part of the community as such. They simply didn't cross my mind. It was a time when there was no concern. I had almost never seen black people. I saw black people when I visited Kansas. My brother lived in Salina, or New Salina. And so we saw what are now, of course, called African Americans, but black people there, buses and so on. Almost none in Colorado, because there certainly weren't. There really almost none on the western slope of Colorado. So as I say, it's not any deep moral concern. It's just that it just seemed common decent that it wasn't a good thing to do. So anyway, that happened. And there was still a real shortage of work for CV in plumbing and pipe fitting at that point. And so he went to Denver to work. So he on Monday mornings, so he could be at work at 8 o'clock in the morning, 75 miles. So I would get up and put Doug and Alan in the car in the back seat, no seatbelts, of course, sleeping, and we would drive to Denver. And then I would have to drive home, and then he would catch a ride on with somebody else on Friday nights. So we stayed in Colorado Springs through that. Well, then finally they started back to work in Colorado Springs because finally they decided they were going to get the Arts Academy, but there was still not very much, and it was into winter. So there's almost nothing there in any event because the weather is just too bad to work kinds of things. So the couple of options. A friend of ours had come to California and said that the construction was just really booming. At this point, we're in 1953. And so there was a lot going on, and it would be a great place to come. The alternative was to go back into the Navy, because he could have done that and just gone in as a career person. Tossed some mental coins around, and right at Thanksgiving then made the decision to try California to see what would happen. So we were living in a house outside of town. It was I don't know, about 5 miles out of Colorado Springs, between Colorado Springs and another kind of village thing. It was a stone house that was attached to a barn. It had actually been a milk house. It had been where the milking worked with milk, and so when it had been a dairy farm, it's no longer a dairy farm, and so they were renting the house. It had tile floors, so it was miserably cold, and totally mice. The kitchen was very, very small, and especially when the weather turned cold, mice started coming in from the fields. We put traps and everything out, and you'd go in the morning, and this kitchen floor would be like covered with mice. It was really exciting. Really, really cold snow and everything. And Doug and Al go play outdoors, which was not really a yard. It was just a big space out in front of this where they'd driven trucks in before. Snow and ice and the snow suits and everything. I know many times Alan would take his shoes off outdoors where he would come back in, and I'd have to go out in the snow and find this kid's shoes. But it was really scary. It was particularly scary that after CB left to come to California. And so I'm waiting, and so the decision was that if he could go to work, that I would stay there until spring, so we could get a little money together and then move to California if this all worked out. Well, he got here at Thanksgiving. He was able to go to work about a week later, and so it looked fine. And we sort of by mail and telephone made the decision that we wouldn't wait till spring for me to bring the boys to California, that in fact I would just close up shop and bring them to California before Christmas. And of course we had no money. I mean, although we were working, it was just going to be expensive to get some stuff done. Our landlord bought much of our furniture. I shipped some few basic things. And at that time, we had this big Packard convertible. Well, just as I went to work, in fact, we bought this thing. And I can't remember why we had to get rid of the car we'd had before that, but we obviously felt we had to. And it was a wonderful car. It was a 49 Packard convertible. And so we're now talking, this is 1953. So it was a really old car, but the people who'd had it probably had a mechanic work on it they shouldn't have, because this was one of the last of the really handmade Packards. These things were really, really nice. So I had this big, heavy car, which was wonderful to drive. I mean, this baby sat down on the road, you knew you had a car. So anyhow, I packed Mother and Dad came to Colorado Springs, took Doug and Alan over to Delta, and I packed up the gear that I could get, stuffed the car all full of everything. This was just the week before Christmas time. And then to Delta and picked up the boys. Mother unloaded the trunk of the car and repacked it and had half space again left. And so I drove then to California with the boys at that point. Again, barely enough money to make it. Got to Barstow and decided to overnight there because I was really afraid of driving by myself into the metropolitan area. And besides, I was probably late enough in the day or something. Anyhow, so we stopped at this motel, and I called him, and staying at the YMCA in Santa Ana. And I got in touch with him and told him where we were, but not exactly where we were, that we were at a hotel in Barstow. And we'd see him. I was scared to death because it was really, really scary. I mean, 2 o'clock in the morning in a motel in Barstow, which was, a wide spot in the road at that point. That it was CB. He decided to come out and meet us, which was really nice because certainly the next day it made it a whole lot easier because never having, driven to Denver through Colorado Springs, but routes I knew and traffic I knew, that driving into the Los Angeles basin alone would have been really terrifying. So That worked really very well, and it was absolutely astonishing. The sun came up in the morning, it was bright, and we went into Riverside, and there was no smog. I mean, it was a great day, clear and beautiful and shine and everything. You had to just feel better. I mean, as a family, we were together again, and so it was just, everything looked really being better because he had arranged then for us to stay at a motel that had a kitchen in Santa Ana. So we got there, midday, and they said, well, too bad, the people who were in it hadn't moved out and we're going to stay for another few days, and they didn't have any more days for us. So this was pretty frustrating because a motel with a kitchen was needed with 2 little kids to cope with, and certainly no money to do anything else with. So we started looking at newspapers to see if we could possibly find a place to rent, and did find a place in Garden Grove, and managed to get hold of the owner who lived in Westminster and rented the house. And that was on a Saturday to get the gas or electricity turned on. But fortunately, CB, being a plumber and pipe fitter, knew how to turn the gas on. So we did get gas, so we had heat, and it was a gas stove. We were able to cook. So we were able to actually function at that point. We were paying, I think, $75 a month. That they included the water in that. And it was particularly funny because when they went out partying, I mean, they all drank quite a lot and had uprights, but so, which was really difficult. And somebody else came in and had a baby. They had a baby in the house for another 2 or 3, and so one of the farm, he was a teacher. Word came out, and we found out then about where he was sent with Alan. It was to rent, and they wouldn't let him wake up to signs because he kept calling from the ship. It was his favorite program. This is a man who's almost 50 years old. Well, apparently he's out there by himself. He let Doug out of the gate. Finally, Navy House, the rest of it was. So we had, of course, Alan was a baby, not on the floor, but here I've got these 2 little kids, and they wrote checks. I was the only one that wrote. They put the money back. They put the checks back here, or even some birthday guys from the ship, Slovis hat. The 4 guys, after it was Christmas time, they brought our 21st birthday down there. I went time and night off and rested for a while carrying Alan because he wasn't walking yet. So we rented a house. First place, we had 2 small children, women had gone to Colorado about night. So I went to work at that if black people came in. And the night manager, I had become the owner happened to find out that I wasn't what they were doing. It was like we're now into late fall when construction really is in this big, because he did it much better than I did next morning. And so then about 2 o'clock in the morning, there's this banging on this motel door. Anyway, so found a lot better all of a sudden without me. And of course with the billing with water.
I didn't know if you wanted to tell that story or not.
Oh, okay. Well, living in the house was really a big yard for the kids, and the agreement had been we would take care of the yard, keep the grass watered and that kind of thing, and there was space for garden back, and so that's fine if we were going along, except after we'd been here a few months, the landlady who had to get a neighbor to bring her over, she lived in Westminster, and she had to get a neighbor to bring her over to our house, came over and threw an absolute raving fit at me because it seems that the water bill, which had been running $2 a month, leaped to $2.50 a month, which he was, of course, absorbing with our rent. And unfortunately, for about an hour of that. Well, this then became a monthly thing because the water bill, unfortunately, we bought a washing machine. We had 2 small children with diapers and things. I mean, Doug was still in diapers. And we had to have, clothes. They used a lot of clothes. We bought a washing machine. And the water bill went up to $2.75 much. I mean, she extended her harangues to like 3 hours, 2.5 hours. She'd come over and she'd sit down and just go on and on and on and on. Well, here I am. I'm still a fairly young mother with 2 small children, and not enough money because although Phoebe was making $3.50 an hour and a little bit more than that by that time, Still in all, really, we were living a very tough life, and it was very, very nerve-wracking. This woman was just driving me literally stark crazy. I knew water bill was going to arrive at her house, and I knew that the next day she would be at my house taking up my time and shouting at for wasting all the water. So we decided to buy a house. We didn't have any money to speak of, but this era when they were doing second mortgage kind of things all built into their original mortgage, and so we started looking around at houses at that point. Well, we got sort of short-circuited on this at this point because some people known in Colorado Springs came out and stayed with us for about 3 weeks. Had two children who were really impossible. The girl was, I think, about 11, and the boy 12, almost 13, something like that. Bitten by a rattlesnake, and they had used some kind of anti-venom thing with her, and she'd gotten really quite ill. And during a period of time she was quite ill, she became quite spoiled, and she had gained a whole weight, so she was a very chubby child. The boy was not too difficult to get along with, but sneaky. Tended to sneak around and do things. And among other things, they would sneak around towards our neighbor's house and get into things from there. Well, they decided that they wanted to buy a house, and they decided that they would buy a house in Westminster, and they could get a house with literally only $260 down. And so we had gotten just about enough money to put down for a house that we thought we wanted to get, and we were only going to have to put down about $350 for it. But in the dark of the night, we had talked about this, and why don't we loan them the money so that they can buy a house and get out of our house, or they will move into our new house when we move in, because it was just terrible. I mean, there were kinds of things that were cool about this. Anyway, so we did that, but we wrote and asked my father, and he loaned us $200. But then, when he found out later that we'd actually borrowed it because we were loaning money, he was very angry with us. $200 was a fair amount at that time. The backstory on this is my father never had less than from the time, the mid-30s, that he carried with him, and because he was very nervous about having been through the addiction and the job situation and everything. And I didn't know that until his certainly high school age. So $200, although it was a fair amount of money, wasn't a lot of money, and this left a really, really bad knot in our stomachs. It's just that we couldn't get him to understand how important it is for us to have the people not move into our new house with us. So we paid it back rather quickly, more quickly than we might otherwise, and moved into our new house. On the same day, the cleaning people moved out. The cleaning people were in. It went to escrow, and they told us it would be about a month, and it took 6 weeks. And after the month's time was up, I was in their office every single day saying, when it's going to clear. So we moved into the house August 25th of 1954. And as I say, the cleaning people had barely moved out of the house when we moved in. We had as nearly no furniture as possible. Beds, stove was built, unfortunately. We had to buy a secondhand refrigerator. But essentially it was just a very strange time. Friends had given us a little television, but it had a big cabinet. It was a huge cabinet. The screen was, I think, 9 inches across. That's 9-inch diagonal. So we had in our living room, this bare living room, a floor at night, and watched our 9-inch television, which was kind of our form of entertainment for a while, but, gradually did other things. Doug started school in 1955, started kindergarten, had a terrible year. They were building a lot of schools around here then, the schools, and all of a sudden, when we moved into Garden Grove, I think there were some 7,000 people living in Garden Grove, and that was 1954, late 1953 when we actually moved into the house we rented. In 1954 we moved into this house. By 1956 there were about 56,000 people, almost 50,000 people in 2 or 3 years. So a great many people moved in, a lot of houses, so there was really serious need for schools. So when Doug started school, he had this kindergarten at a school over on Trask, because Evan's school, where he did go to school, uh, was uh, was under construction, but that's what it was. It was under construction. It was open to use. So at Christmas time, or at the 1st of January, it did move the kids that belonged up this way in Evans. The kindergarten rooms didn't have any doors, the big doors or panel kind of things. So they had to wear their coats all the time. The first few weeks they were there. Well, his second half of kindergarten year was just so difficult for all of us. It was incredible. He hadn't had childhood diseases because for a variety of reasons he hadn't really been around other children all that much. So he had mumps, followed by the measles, followed by the chicken pox, and then had to have his appendix out. Alan, of course, followed with every disease 2 weeks later, because as soon as as he had the opportunity, he came down with the next disease. So that whole spring was just incredibly difficult. And of course, Doug hated kindergarten because every time he went back, I mean, it's like all new. He was out for the whole time. So they had Easter week, and he was back in school a week, and that's when he had to go down and have his appendix out. In other words, 1 full week of school was all he had from January till Elon. And so then we did the appendix thing. That was pretty traumatic because he was at St. Joseph's. No, it wasn't St. Joseph's Hospital. Doesn't matter. It was community hospital, Santa Ana. And the morning after he'd had his appendix out, and I went over because I spent most of the day with him, and his father was part of the time. And some nurse came in and told him to sit up. She's going to do something. And I said, well, but he can't because he's had his appendix out. She says, no, the chart says he's had his tonsils out. And I'm his mother, his appendix out. Well, no. So she went raging out of the place, and then she back in and didn't. But this was a little nerve-wracking. My child is in this hospital. This woman does not know that this kid has had his appendix out, in contrast to having his tonsils out, which, by the way, we probably should have had out at the same time because he had a lot of trouble with them later. At any rate, it was just an enormously difficult year for him, and and for me too. As a form of recreation, and because I'd really never learned to swim, I decided to go to Y and take swimming lessons. My friend of mine had suggested it, and so I had my swimming lesson for a while, and then I'd go off a week or two because I couldn't get in there. And so I went in once for the swimming lesson, and the woman says, well, today we're jumping in the deep end of the pool. And I said, I'm not jumping in the deep end of the pool. Yes, everybody is. Well, I did. And of course, I thought I was drowning. I was flailing all over the place and everything, and carried on. Got out of the pool finally. And she said, all right, we're doing it again. That's it. Not doing it again. So I left off learning to swim at that point. I was so tired. Rest at all with little sick kids the whole time, and especially when they were sick with different things. It was really, and of course, then the automatic thing was that we kept waiting for Alan to have his appendix out. I mean, he had everything else. Surely he was going to do that. So it was just a really crazy different time. But it was also a time that when I see things once in a while on a nostalgia program or something, I'll see something about what in the news or in politics or anything like that. Absolutely have no recollection whatever. When you're sort of struggling along, and your life is 2 small children and keeping your husband, fed and clothed. Everything was related to school and church. I did a fair number of church-related kinds of things. But into what was going on in the wider world, almost didn't even know it was happening. Obviously, if something major happened, you heard it. But in thinking back and thinking about the things I remember from the time outside of this little cocoon that I was working in, I remember almost none of it. It's just you pay attention to what's going on, what your daily breath required. And then eventually, of course, after having been through all of the kind of things one does, is take the 3rd graders to Mid-San Juan Capistrano, and 5th graders dancing at Not Berry Farm for the square dance kind of things and all this. You begin to kind of surface a little there must be something out there besides, besides just doing this kind of thing and realizing that you need to do something else and think about something else. Okay, I'll let you do the bread right now. And, this is N has writing along the side of it, so I stopped clicking my fingernails, but I'm clicking them.
Okay, a little better. It's hard.
Yeah, if there's anything to do about it, we'll do that. At any rate, in the 50s, after we got into this house, and because although CB was making substantially more money than Ben, we still didn't have any money to speak of. Certainly nothing extra, just because it just cost a certain amount of money to kind of keep it going. But obviously it was more comfortable. The weather was so much nicer. It was easier to. The kids could play outdoors most of the time and didn't have anywhere nearly the problem with expensive clothes, but also just of dealing with having heavy winter clothes on. So it was a much better place to bring children than Colorado, where I'd grown up, where weather was a major deterrent to practically everything and really cold and icy and everything in the winter time. So in most ways, things were just a lot better. I didn't miss friends and people much from Delta because gradually almost all the people that I had known I had been friends with had as we had moved on to other places, and although we certainly didn't take advantage of any of the cultural aspects of living in California because we couldn't really afford to, the opportunities were out there, and there were some things around without paying to park. And so it was an easy thing to do to get them out in the air and have some fun. To visit my parents, and we went up to Uray, where there's a major big swimming pool that's got naturally heated waters. And so I took the boys into the pool. Well, this was terrifying because they were so used to the tide, the beach, the waves coming up on the beach. They came up and they went out. So you were in the water and they went back out like that. But water that just stayed still on them proved to be terrifying. Alan just screamed, one blood-curdling scream after another. Because Alan tended to do the lections of Alan was when we were in San Diego, and this was when he was really a baby, sitting up, because I remember sitting up, so he was probably somewhere in the 5 or 6 months age, and very round, because Alan got round early. We went to the San Diego Zoo, which was actually less expensive than it is now. But that was a good Sunday outing for us, so we took him and put him down on the grass. Well, he had never been on grass before. He had bare legs. He was just in a diaper or short romps or something. So his bare legs with his grass on them. He sat there screaming one blood-curdling scream after another. Alan was never a really nature-related person as a small child. So that was one of those kind of difficult. But in general terms, the early years in Italy, most of the other families in the neighborhood were people very like us, had small children, so there were a lot of kids around. Interestingly enough, boys. One of them is that all three boys never really had an opportunity to grow up and play with little girls. There weren't little girls in the mix and playing hide and seek or whatever, because the neighborhood just didn't have little girls. There were a couple of girls who were older, but not younger ones that would be at an age in a kind of a general play group thing. Not that there were play groups in those days. You played with the neighborhood kids. So, but all the neighbor kids that were around were little boys, but much in the same age range. There were plenty of kids to play with and things. School at Evans, went there for his kindergarten once kindergarten started, but then in the first grade had to go over to Brookhurst School because town had gotten so crowded, they drew the line kind of down Maury Lane or someplace like that. And that would probably actually. Really convinced that left-handed people should learn to write right-handed. It was just a mannerism that they use their left hand. And so we had Doug had a really bad first grade year. He was, the kindergarten thing is obviously part of a problem because he had such a bad time being so ill. But this terrible woman who just forced him to learn to write right-handed, a fairly young mother and intimidated entirely by this woman, although I talked to her a number of times, I didn't come right out and do anything desperate about it because I was really afraid to. Well, I should have done. Fortunately, he had a very good second grade teacher back at Evans then. Tough woman, really hard woman to get along with, but turned out she was an excellent teacher for kind of overcoming the problems that had developed in his first grade year. And so he did really very well after, although probably fifth grade before he got really, really great talented at Evans. So and that was our exercise because Alan needed exercise. Alan took 2 naps a day until he was, well, in kindergarten. He just got 1 nap a day because he had to go to kindergarten in the morning. We started getting into the whole Cub Scout, no real hobbies. CB did a lot of construction kinds of things, did work on the house, and of course, when you, Mark, were very small, we started the playroom because we needed more space to be able to do things in the winter and one thing and another. And of course, that proved to be a really good place for people who were learning to play trumpet and things like that later. But by the time you were born, we were so involved in all kinds of school activities. It was the sort of very typical kind of thing with a family. We have all these baby pictures of Douglas, with a few of Alan, and it's really hard to find pictures of you because there were just so many things happening at that point. But it was, I think it was mostly pretty good. I don't really remember, and maybe because there wasn't really time to think about it, having any particular thoughts about how I felt about how life was, you know. And that's one reason that makes it hard to think about now how it was. Kind of a plain. Most everything was pretty good. We had very little illness in the family, and if it was fairly minimal. Doug went through a really bad kind of a time of having ragingly high fever, and that we found happened sometimes, and fortunately didn't lead to anything else. So that was, but literally we didn't have, like, people didn't have broken arms, broken legs, serious illness. So essentially the 50s were all right. I think probably very plastic, as most of the 50s kind of look back programs so on are. You had all of these service people who had come out, had children who were pretty much the same age as ours, the war being over. Because I don't know whether your father would have, I'm sure your father would have gone to college. Hard to say what kind of a job he'd ever wound up with, because before he went into the Navy, he worked as a cowboy, he worked in a uranium, very hit or miss kinds of things. But once he came out of the Navy and had an opportunity to serve an apprenticeship, get an education, to actually have a job that over the long haul paid a good substantial amount of money. But there wasn't anything during that period of time that was particularly notable. I think we, at the time there probably were things that seemed notable then, either good or bad. But over the long haul, when you start thinking about response to things, nothing really comes to mind was particularly striking. But it was a pretty good life. We had because when we had enough money to get by on, it still wasn't any waste. So most of our parties, 2 or 3 Saturday nights, we'd have a party at our house or at somebody else's house, and people would bring food, bring their own bottles and so on. And we're a group of about, I don't know, probably about 25 of us that had these Saturday night parties. And that's pretty much our social from CB's work. I think without exception, people that we actually had parties with at that point were people that he worked with. You know. We neighbors, but it was more coffee parties in the mornings. I had coffee with the woman the 2 women who lived directly almost, well, certainly 4 or 5 mornings a week, women, and about the kids, whatever was happening. In terms of asking people to parties, not much. You know, you do some barbecue kinds of things, but barbecuing wasn't anywhere nearly as big then as it became later, a more casual thing. All that many eat-out parties. You ate out, it was because you cooked it and the kids carried it out to do things, but it wasn't the thing you did all that much. So no, we didn't. Partly, I think, because the men in the neighborhood had as nearly nothing in common with your father as I can imagine. The man directly across the street got off selling swimming pools. And it was the one of little shyster-ish kind of things that he had done. The husband of the other woman that had coffee with a lot wrote books, but also worked as an accountant or something. So we're talking about people who had just quite different interests. The house directly next door had a real weird history. People who bought in first were very similar. Then after they left, they were, I guess it was probably Tom Jackson. They had children the age of, they had a little girl your age, a little boy younger. He was a mean, and they had a baby that died within about 2 weeks after its birth. And but they hadn't had a really very good life before that. We weren't aware about how much it was, but at any rate, they had a particularly ill situation. And then the house got turned over several other times, was rented. Once it rented to some people who let their children start to get around the streets and set fires and other kind of exciting things. So they'd become really close friends for obvious reasons. And then probably funniest ones, if funny was the word, they moved in, immediately started buying all furniture and everything. Turned out that's what they did. How they actually set up credit things, I guess credit rating firms weren't as good at the time as they are nowadays. But they would buy a whole lot of things on credit, furniture and cars and this sort of thing, and houses, because they bought that house however they did it. And they had to put more than their $110 down, and so probably not a lot at that point. And when the creditors finally got really clamped, they would disappear. And that they did from that house too. But they had a whole house full of stuff, and then they all of them overnight they're gone. Then the very first Jewish family that I had ever lived near, because in Colorado, to the best of my knowledge, I don't remember ever meeting Jewish people. And so this Jewish family, a woman and her husband and a baby, moved in, and they were funny because they were a cartoon of Jewish people. She walked in to everybody's houses. The idea of knocking to come into somebody's house, totally out of her idea of how to do things. So she would walk into your house carrying the baby, and so as the 3 women of us had coffee and one another pretty often. Well, she got to including herself in this. We tried really hard not to include her in, and got to skulking around back of houses to get into back doors and everything. Because she would ask the most embarrassing kind of questions. Just really nosy about all kinds of things. Who was suing somebody for either real harm or not. He managed to slip and fall in a gasoline station and sued them. And I had several lawsuits going. But he also changed jobs in the 2 years they were there, not even quite 2 years. He changed jobs about 5 different times, and he was always making like $10 or $20 a year more every time. And so we figured by the time that they left, they must have been about $500,000 a year because she'd come over and tell about all this wonderful thing. It was really nice when they left because you hate being one of the funniest things the woman ever did. Unfortunately, it wasn't the house, but the people across the street, the man who was the author and so on, because of her habit of walking in, and his habit apparently of walking around in brief undershorts, like, I think it was, okay, we need to cut this off now. Well, when kept going into people's houses any time of the day or even in the evening, without knocking her in, she'd just walk in. So she walked into this across the street. This man was crossing his living room and apparently had on very brief undershorts. And he was going to the bathroom to someplace and walked in the middle of his living room. Woman came crashing into his house. Well, he walked in on him before, but he had been full dressed. He was annoyed by her, but he said this was the straw, and he would start locking their house doors. And at that point, we didn't lock our doors at all, except pretty much at night, but usually didn't during the daytime. And so we all picked this, we all started doing this. But visibly, I could just, think about the look on this guy's face probably when this terrible woman just walked into his house with absolutely no warning. And so it was really crazy. She was just a very difficult neighbor to have because we had tried politely to exclude her from things. One of the worst she did to us, to our family, by the way, one of the mornings we were having coffee that she'd intruded on, Alan was there because he was just bitty at the time. I don't know how you've been, probably a 3, maybe. At any rate, and according to her, she was funny, but she shook her fingers in his face, and she said, "You're an ugly, ugly, ugly little boy." And she didn't look as if she was amused or anything. Alan was a round, thick little kid, kind of cute. He certainly wasn't a pretty child at that point, but he certainly wasn't an ugly child. He looked at her, and I wanted to hit. I really wanted to hit her really badly. I didn't care what I thought she was doing. I told her so. Kind of thing this woman did. Just enormously difficult to be around. But other than that, generally speaking, the neighbors were pretty good neighbors. Essentially, most had to do with neighbors, where they had to do with school kind of things, and then we got into Cub Scout things and so on. I mean, the people you saw because you were more involved with them, except for the car things around here. And the people directly across the street, the swimming pool salesman, he got really angry, and we didn't want a swimming pool in our yard. We didn't think we needed one for sorts of reasons, and among others, it didn't make sense. Coming from Colorado, the swimming pool in your yard is not. A lot of people did, and I'm sure if you fly over here, there are swimming pools in every other yard, but it wasn't anything we wanted to have. And so he got really angry with us, and really wasn't, didn't want to be neighbors. And but his wife remained friendly, so we saw them. Other than that, what else? Where do you want to go? I became active in the League of Women Voters in 1967. By that time, and my youngest son was going to high school, about something along there. I had been doing, junior high. I had been doing their thing with all the gay things and so on. I was speaking sentences of single syllable words, and it began to occur to me that there was another world out there. Because I was taken up, now that the other two were off just about in college, Alan still had a couple, and needed something. Connie Lapp, whose husband was city manager at the time, talked me into going to a League of Women Voters meeting. They were starting a league in Garden Grove. It was breaking off from Fullerton, so Anaheim and Garden Grove people were going to go together. And went, all of these terribly intelligent women talking about all of these things in the world and the nation and politics and on. And I thought, there's no way that I could possibly associate with these people. I don't know anything. However, me and some of the other people being really persistent kept me going to lead meetings, and began not to be more confident about what I knew, but at least began to learn more things because I was associating with people who had things and outside of just the microcosm of home and school. Um, and probably the first thing that was useful to learn to do in the league, but was really thinking at the time, was talking ballot measures to groups. And even in school, I hated speaking out in class. It was just really traumatic to have to open my mouth, class or anything. So this was really world changing. I took a class at Santa Ana College, and it almost killed me. It was so terrible. So I was, because I wanted to get over that, but it wasn't working. So some of the league members persuaded me to work one ballot measure, and they'd help. I worked on this, and I was scared of it, but I got up, and it was in the Anaheim Library. And I got up and did my presentation, this ballot measure. And because I had all memorized the thing and everything, I did it really fairly well. I got through it. Unfortunately, this man in the audience stood up and asked a question. I had memorized my material. I hadn't learned anything. And so I was standing there, I'm sure looking like a deer in a headlight. And his wife, who is one of the smartest women I know, and she's like 82 or something now, and she's just incredibly bright person. At any rate, kindly sort of stepped in and said, well, it may be da-da-da-da. And so she answered his question. And so I lived through it. And having lived through once, why you think, well, maybe you could live through it again. And, gradually that's sort of what happened. So it got to the point where I actually was not always comfortable getting up in front of groups and talking about things, but most times coping very well. And nowadays, so the league has been one of the really best things in my personal life in terms of giving me an opportunity to be something besides a mother sitting here on an empty nest worrying about where the kiddies are. One continues to worry about the children, but league has given me something to be interested in and perspective of my world than I'd even imagined having if I hadn't gotten involved with the league.